Sorry to be so late. Good afternoon. I apologize for running late. um, but it's great to be here on this important series. So, my role, I'm Pedro Noguera, Dean of the Rossier School of Education, and we initiated these grand challenges, of which this series that you're going to hear about in a moment is a part, as a way to try to bring our community together around topics that cut across our field. We did the first one on teaching and learning. What more important topic than that in a university, but particularly in a school of education? And then we did the next one on science denialism and racism denialism. And we teach two faculty who work on those issues. And then we did a next series focused on health and on the health of educators who are so often stressed and challenged by the work they do because it's emotionally taxing. This series is on democracy and the role of education in our democracy, and how timely. When higher education, including this institution, is being targeted, and we're grappling with what it means to ensure that we are preparing our students to participate in a democracy, not only during elections, but in between elections, because democracy is not just about the voting, it's also about participation. And as we see right now with our government shutdown, we suddenly realize, wow, government touches so many aspects of our lives. How many were trying to fly into Burbank last night? Right? Thank God, no. I flew in last night, I had to get until 1 in the morning last night, but I wasn't affected by that. So, but anyway, government, democratic practice is central to, has been to this country's traditions. What role does education play in ensuring that the people have the ability to participate fully, understand what their rights are, understand how to distinguish between false information and misinformation and facts, all critical to democracy. The founding fathers, particularly Thomas Jefferson, knew it, and that was the reason why they made the case that educating the public was essential if democracy was going to be upheld. So today we have a great panel. My job is simply to introduce the session and turn it over to our moderator, Professor Anthony Maddox, who is going to moderate this session. On to you, Anthony.
Thank you, Dean Noguera. Welcome, everybody. Always, okay, I'm good? Okay, excellent. Welcome, everyone. Always good to see you here. Anthony Maddox, Professor of Clinical Education and Engineering at Rossier and the Viterbi School of Engineering. Background with AI many, many decades ago, so I've seen this coming. And so there's more coming at the same time. We're gonna have a really robust panel. I think we had a great discussion up here before we got started, so I think you're in for a treat. So let me just introduce our panelists right now before we get started. Mr. Robert Medrano, Senior Program Director at Teach Democracy, a national nonpartisan nonprofit dedicated to student civic learning. A former secondary social studies teacher, thank you for your service. And an instructional coach, he now develops curriculum and leads professional learning to help educators connect instruction to real-world issues. Thus, at Teach Democracy, he definitely does that. He also serves as a project specialist with the USC Democracy Project, working to expand equitable civic engagement opportunities for students across California. So his work centers on youth civil dialogue and expanding opportunities for student civic participation. Please join me in welcoming Robert Medrano. Next, we have Nicole Mirra. Nicole Mirra is Associate Professor of Education and Faculty Director of the Teacher Education Program at the University of California, Los Angeles. Her research utilizes participatory design methods in classroom, community, and digital spaces to collaboratively create learning environments with teachers and youth that disrupt structures of racial injustice and creatively compose liberatory social futures. She previously taught secondary literacy and debate in Brooklyn, New York, and Los Angeles, California, and is a proud member of the National Writing Project Network. Her books include Doing Youth Participatory Action Research, Transforming Inquiry with Researchers, Educators, and Students, educating for empathy, literacy, learning, and civic engagement, and civics for the world to come, committing to democracy in every classroom. Please welcome Nicole Mirra. And Corinne Hyde is a professor of clinical education at the University of Southern California's Rossier School of Education. That's us, where she teaches across 6 master's and doctoral programs. She was the winner of the 2023 Rossier Excellence in Teaching Award. Her expertise lies in instructional technologies, information literacy, educational psychology, and teaching for equity and justice. She has been certified as a K-12 teacher, thank you, and administrator in multiple states. And prior to becoming a professor, she served in a variety of roles in the field of education from the pre-K through post-secondary level. Her current research focuses on the use of generative AI in post-secondary instruction. She works remotely from the Portland, Oregon metro area with her husband, 2 children, and her dog. Please welcome Dr. Hyde.
So first off, I want to thank everyone for being here for this important conversation. I've spoken to some panelists up here already, and I can think of no better group than educators in this country to tackle these challenges before us. And civic education is going to play a key role. And so many of my remarks are about civic education, the state of civic education in the United States, the challenges before us. There are many, but I'm just going to speak on a few. And then opportunities within the civic education space to not only sustain, but also reimagine democracy. So first off, I kind of want to show you, I'm actually going to jump ahead a little out of order. I kind of want to show you 2 statistics, or one statistic and then the state of policy. I want to start at the systems first. So in 2022, Carnegie published a report that looked at funding for civic education in this country. And they found that for every $50 we dedicate to STEM, 5 cents goes to civic education. That's not to diminish the importance of STEM, but I do want to highlight funding disparities when it comes to civic education in this country. Funding has improved over the past recent years since that statistic was published, but it's arguably not enough right now. The other thing I want to call out is state policies around civic education. When we look at how different states, or what they require rather, to get a high school diploma, I put together a simple map here. So 8 states, to get a high school diploma, 8 states don't even require that you take a civics course. 7 states require that you take a full year of civics. 31 plus require, such as California, require that you take half a year course to get a high school diploma. So I think some argue that maybe that's not enough when we think about sustaining and reimagining democracy. The bullet points that I've highlighted here come from studies of standards and practice. So traditionally, civics in this country would focus on government structures, how the government works, national observances like remembering dates. Oftentimes, you'll see when they speak of civic action, it might center on voting or formal acts, perhaps contacting a public official. And as I'll speak to later, there's many other things we could consider beyond those formal acts. Typically, the vocabulary that you'll find in curriculum in government classes is focused on narrow terms like citizen, but it takes a legal status approach, and it narrows it to some degree to not consider different notions of how individuals in this nation participate. So there is a risk if this is all we get, and this is not bad, you need to know how the government works, but if this is all we get, it risks simplifying civic education in this country. There are challenges abound. I'm actually gonna show you a few things real quick. Let me skip ahead here. Okay. So a report out of UCLA School of Law, they studied between 2021 and 2022. There were 563 measures introduced to prohibit the teaching of divisive concepts about race. No shock, a study that came out a year later through RAND, the American Teacher Survey, found that 2/3 of public school educators decided that they were not going to introduce or talk about complex social issues in the classroom. So I'm just indicating those 2 studies. At the same time, I do want to highlight work out of Rossier and Dornsife that showed that, believe it or not, there is bipartisan support on talking about controversial issues on some topics at some grade levels. There's a lot of nuance there, but there is large bipartisan support for talking about complex things in the classroom. And so some of the points I highlight here are, I think, in line with some of those studies. So for example, Folks are scared to talk about these. If you're a teacher, there is a risk in some states that you could be censured. You could risk losing your job. There is fear of backlash, not just from an administrator. I hear stories from California teachers getting backlash from administrators for talking about some issues. And then there's also fear of backlash from parents or the community at large for talking about certain things. The other thing I want to highlight is it puts teachers in a very uncomfortable position. So when you talk about issues, there's generally a lack of support, whether we're talking about funding to get teacher professional learning around facilitating these type of conversations. And so it puts teachers in a tenuous position where there's a fear of course, backlash, but also what is my role as a facilitator? Am I neutral? And if I choose neutrality, do I risk upholding the status quo around harmful views? So there's challenges in that space as well. The last thing I want to just touch on, we'll have plenty of time to dive into this, is the opportunities within the civic space. Go back. Sorry, Nicole. There's plenty of opportunities abound. So we can expand how we think about civic participation to privilege things that students are already doing, whether they're engaged in online spaces, having conversations with the community, helping their neighbor out. There's many sorts of civic actions that they take that we can privilege into the classroom. And so what I really want us to take away with is these schools are laboratories of democracy where kids can critically think, talk about complex issues, not just get ready to tackle the problems before us, but to think about how do we tackle the problems that we can't even see coming yet. And I think education is going to play a big part in this. And so I'll end my remarks there, and I'll hand it over to Nicole.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks again for inviting me to be here. Anytime we could have a conversation about democracy, it's an important one to have, as Dr. Mirra mentioned. And be able to do that with folks here is really exciting. And so it's worth coming across town for. What you see up here in front of you is an interaction between two high schoolers on a social network that I created several years ago for a research project called the Digital Democratic Dialogue, or 3D project. And this is a project where high schoolers and their teachers from communities across the United States in very different geographic and ideological areas came together to talk about their civic pasts, reflect on their civic present, and then dream of their civic futures. And they did this within the context of their English teachers' classrooms. And that's because I'm an English teacher. And I was frustrated when I was a teacher about the fact that civic education, or when we think about democracy, we often think only about social studies. And we love our social studies colleagues, of course. But the idea is that all teachers are civics teachers, because the choices that we make, no matter what subject area we teach, no matter what grade level we teach, are communicating messages to young people about what our public life could be like together. So I purposely wanted to include English teachers and their students in this kind of social network and have them talk across their differences. And we did it using, you might notice this is an old platform. I don't know if any teachers are in the room and can see what platform this is. It's now died. It's Edmodo. Anybody remember Edmodo? What? R.I.P. Edmodo, it's gone. But this also speaks to the fact that it's very difficult to create a social network for young people that is protected, that doesn't use schoolified tools such as Google Classroom, Edmodo. It's very difficult to create the safety needed for a research project or for young people to talk on a closed network without using some of the tools of, X, Instagram, TikTok. Those are all unprotected tools that are also monetized and are more about consumption than they are about dialogue, which is a problem that we'll come back to later. But Brandon, the first student, is a student, first speaker in this conversation, is a student from rural Northern California. And Marcus, the second speaker, is a student from a city in Pennsylvania. And they are in a group because they have chosen to talk about the issue of gun violence and guns. So you'll see it says Gun Issues 1. In the group that I organized, which had about 250 young people from across the country, the number one issue that students wanted to discuss was guns, which also says something about our civic fabric that we live in, because gun violence was something that touched students no matter what community they lived in across the United States. 3 things I want to note very quickly about this quick exchange. So first, the teachers had encouraged students to get into groups and not to have an argument, but to dialogue about these civic issues. There were other groups that talked about immigration, gender. There were many different groups that were going on at the same time. But you'll notice that Brandon says, hello everyone, I'll be joining you in this debate. And that was unprompted. That was because young people in our schools have been socialized to believe over time that any discussion of a civic issue or a social issue in life is immediately an argument or a debate, because that's how schools structure what civic dialogue often looks like. I'm sure we've all been in classrooms and there's the pro and the con and you just get assigned a side. I've been a debate coach. I understand some of the value, but also some of the danger or limitations of reducing everything to a debate. But the young people came in immediately ready to debate. And the second thing that you'll notice is that information, which we'll be talking about today, information systems, it's being used as pretty much like a cudgel. It's like a tool, like they went out and they found quotes that supported their point of view, because they're taught, again, that their experience is not expertise. They need to go find a credentialed source, and they need to then throw that piece of data, that factoid, at their opponent to say, well, this is what the data says, and then someone else says, well, this is what the data says. And we can go back and forth all day. And at the end of the day, the third thing to notice is that I noticed that in 80% of the interactions that the young people are having on the social network, when they did this argumentation, what I call talking points, back and forth, the conversations always died within about 2 to 3 moves after that, because there's nowhere to go. And any of us that have been on a social network and have tried to argue with a family member or a friend or a stranger know that we don't usually get very far in social network dialogue, because we often are not, again, we don't feel any kind of relationality. And we're also taught that this is the way that laws are made. We're taught this is the way that the civic fabric works. But we know that it's broken. It's not working and has never been working. And so the students and the teachers that are in this network in our study, we all reflected on these conversations, and the students weren't feeling satisfied. The teachers weren't feeling satisfied. We're like, something's not happening here. We're not communicating. We're not actually talking about anything. We're just using information, which, again, some of it is not even accurate, which we're going to get to later on, the accuracy of information. But that wasn't even really the point. The point was that we weren't even getting anywhere in terms of learning who each other was or what we could do about this very complicated issue. So what happened was the teachers and the students all got together, and they kind of developed over time through the process of the study what we called the 4 C's. And that's meant that they were going to take a step back, step away from argumentation for a moment, step away from facts, and lean into their own personal experiences. And so these are photos that Brandon and Marcus posted onto the social network. And at first glance, it may look like another talking point. I support guns. Here's an example of gun violence. But because of the work the teachers had done in what we called the 4 C's, which was responding to each other with, I'm going to get it wrong again, care, community, connection, and curiosity. Those are the 4 C's that they were encouraged to lean into with each other, and we had guiding prompts for them. Brandon posted a picture of, again, this is also flipping the script on what we often think about in California. We often think there aren't people living in communities where they support gun ownership, but in rural Northern California, this was a tool of daily life. And the student posted a picture of a gun on a porch and said, this is a tool that I use in my community. And Marcus showed a picture of a memorial that was in his community to a victim of gun violence. And it was a very powerful moment of not talking points, but of deep empathetic connection for a moment. The veil of talking points fell for a moment, and there was a chance for the two of them to say, wow, like that's so totally different than my personal experience. What does it mean to live in a civic community together where we have to make decisions about guns when both of these things are happening at the same time and are both true to our own experiences? That's a much deeper, there's no answer to this conversation. We didn't figure it out over the course of this school year, but that's the kind of thinking that I think is a lot more valuable for young people to be doing than to just be pulling out those argumentation talking points, right? So very quickly, and I'll pass it on the right-hand side here, there's a quote from Marcus, who was the second person that participated in this dialogue. And he said, as he was reflecting on the experience of getting to know another student who lived in a very different place and had very different ideas, he said, it's kind of surreal because it's kind of like, hey, there are people out there outside of you, and there are people that exist and have lives and have experiences that aren't you. And that's kind of weird to think about. So seeing these other people and reading about the experiences they've had, it's very eye-opening. And I argue that at the end of the day, that's what civic education is about, more so than about learning the facts and figures about how our government works. If we can't start from a place of being empathetic or interested in the perspectives of someone outside of us, then anything else is lost. So starting from a place where in high school, young people are thinking about what it means to dialogue together, that's the start of what civic education, I think, could be, in this, especially this divided moment. And on the left-hand side, I've been thinking about what it means to change the things we do in schools. So as an English teacher, I'm thinking about argument writing. I've been a part of the problem as an English teacher, and many of us have done those 5-paragraph essays. What if instead of putting a thesis out, defending it at all costs, and attacking any counter-argument? What if we instead thought that we start every discussion of a controversial issue or of a what should we do question with articulating the needs of everyone involved, engaging in some empathetic imagination, speculating about what might be possible, even if it doesn't seem plausible at the moment. Let's dream together for a moment of what it would look like if this issue was solved. And then let's move backward to be pragmatic and try something together and reflect on how it went and try something different. What if we learned how to do that process in school instead of learning how to defend an argument at all costs? I'll pause there. Thank you.
So let's see if I can figure out how this works. Hey, there we go. Well, I'm really glad to be able to come here and talk with you all today about information and truth and technology and democracy. I'm joining you from war-torn Portland today, which makes this a very relevant conversation for me personally right now. And so I decided to frame this around 3 questions, thinking about all of this as a system. When we're thinking about, first off, how have our information ecosystems changed in this current moment? We have a whole lot of challenges. We have a whole lot of opportunities, right? We all know this. There's a lot of, really difficult things going on in the world right now. There are a lot of really potentially wonderful things going on. And how we choose to respond to this is going to determine our future. Because when we're talking about information ecosystems in relation to democracy, we have to be able to base our democracy on truth, right? If we can't agree that the truth is even important in the first place, and we speak up and say, hey, this is not accurate, then we don't have a very strong democracy. So I gotta stand up because I can't sit in one place. So when we're thinking about challenges and opportunities here, we could potentially go down a path of, what, we'll be fine, guys, we'll be fine. But we could make a lot of money with all the AI and all the changes, and by, changing what is true to whom and when and whether we agree or not and what's on TV and all this, right? There's this fire hose of information that's coming out at us all the time. Think about how many different pieces of information you encounter in any given day, and whether or not you're able to tell if those pieces of information are true or not at first glance, if they are authoritative, if they're from a reliable source, if anybody has fact-checked it, is the fact-checking accurate? Who's doing the fact-checking, right? So this, among many other things that are happening right now, are all part of this or affecting these information ecosystems that we exist in. So, you have this information ecosystem around you all the time, multi-layered information ecosystems. So, if I'm talking to my friends and we're talking about topics, we've got our information ecosystem there, we're sharing things, we're interested in particular things, we're connecting with each other. If I'm with my work colleagues, different information ecosystem. If I'm reading the news, we can think about and define these information ecosystems in all different ways. But regardless, they're going to be impacted by, at minimum, what we see up here. And I want to point your attention to just a couple of things that I tend to spend more of my time thinking about these days and working on, is algorithmic bias. Hopefully we've somewhat heard of this before, the idea that we as humans have biases. We created the AI. We trained the AI models on our data, all of our creations as humanity, and therefore it is reflecting this bias that we have. And, in addition to that, we don't really have any kind of global strategy or agreement that says, we're not going to make the evil AI, right, guys? We're going to do the good one, not Skynet. But no, we don't have that agreement at all. And so it's a little bit of a free-for-all right now. We're still in the days of not having a lot of laws to help us figure out what should and shouldn't be done with AI and these other advanced technologies that are coming through. And the limitations of AI is a big factor too, because a lot of people are looking at AI right now and going, oh my God, this is incredible. I can, just put this question in here and it's going to answer it for me, and it sounds amazing. but it has limitations, right? And I've discovered this a lot recently as I've been trying to work on stuff. One really interesting thing that I've noticed is the difference between someone who is a content expert working with an AI, a generative AI model, to talk with it about the work that they're doing, versus someone who is not a content expert talking with the AI. Because you can understand, how to interface with an AI, right? That's a particular set of technological skills. But understanding whether or not what you are getting from the AI is accurate, and all of the other associated ethical, societal implications that go along with using the AI, that's a different story. And so there's an element of really having to think about what's behind the scenes with all of this, and whether or not when we choose to use these things, we are really thinking about all of the potential implications, or at least all the ones that we're aware of. We do have a lot of opportunities though, right? There are some incredibly transformational things happening right now in the field of education around AI. There's absolutely just mesmerizing stuff. You'll see kids, sitting down, engaging with an AI in a role play, for example. Like, okay, can you, pretend to be Edgar Allan Poe, right? We're gonna have the AI model pretend to be an author, and now the student's gonna sit down and they're gonna ask questions of that author, and Edgar Allan Poe is gonna answer as Edgar Allan Poe, right? And so if you have teacher oversight over this, or you have a more knowledgeable other person to give you some oversight and make sure that this is productive educational conversation, that can be a really, really powerful thing. But we're also seeing some of the downsides, right? And I'm sure you may have heard in the news recently that there's a lot of potential negatives to young folks interacting with AI as well, in terms of understanding the boundaries between what AI really is and what folks think that it might be. So our information ecosystems have dramatically changed. That is a given. We can create anything with very little ability to detect if it is real or not by the average person online. We've got information coming from all kinds of sources, and some of our most trusted sources are no longer reliable. I ran into a challenge in the last several months with my doctoral students, where the things that they had been basing some of their research on, the data, the reports, the information from government sources was just gone, no longer available. And so it is absolutely, this isn't a partisan issue. It's truth or not, availability of information or not. And the second question that I was thinking about deeply in relation to this is, what are the implications of this changing information ecosystem for democracy? Because, I spend a lot of time thinking about what are the implications of this for the classroom, right? When we are going to do teaching and learning in a whole bunch of different settings. But if we're thinking about it for democracy, this gets at this larger civics question, because as my colleagues have been talking about here, civics is embedded in everything that we're teaching. It is always relevant. So I pulled two quotes to your point. I pulled two quotes that I think are kind of representative of where I want to kind of emphasize. So the first is Maria Ressa. She won the Nobel Prize in 2021, Nobel Peace Prize in 2021. She's a journalist from the Philippines, and she was jailed for writing stuff that was not approved by the government in the Philippines. She is thankfully no longer in jail. This is a quote from her. "I don't think we have wrapped our heads around how much technology has allowed the manipulation of individuals and democracies." And then the second side of this is the educational aspect. FDR, we know who he is, I hope. "Democracy cannot succeed unless those who express their choice are prepared to choose wisely. The real safeguard of democracy, therefore, is education." When we're thinking about civics, obviously we're thinking far beyond just voting. We're thinking about all of the different things that you need to do as a citizen in our democracy. And we are ill prepared as a society for making the kinds of decisions we need to make as a democracy. When folks go to engage in the world around them, in large part, they don't understand how the government works, what their rights are, how important information and agreeing on, the truth being important, agreeing on documented facts, agreeing on, scientific evidence. And that even though we can argue about, we can debate about stuff, we can talk about stuff, we can talk about the nuance, but what we can't do is say, we're just not going to let the information in. Because then what happens is we no longer have a democracy. Democracy is of and for the people. This is government of and for the people, by the people. The people can't do that if they don't know about democracy. And they also can't do that if they can't recognize truth and fiction. And so when you go online now, you are going to be faced with that fire hose of truth and fiction coming at you all the time. And it is set up online, all of the places that you engage with, whether it's the news, social media site, whatever it is, these types of places are designed not to get you to learn, not to get you to build community, not to get you to be a better citizen. They're designed to monetize you, to get you to click, get you to engage, and get you to click more, and then click more after that, and then click more after that. And it does not lend itself well to fact checking before you share, to having a nuanced debate, just like my colleagues were talking about, right? This environment doesn't lend itself well to that. So we've set up this kind of environment where we don't really have this robust public space where we're talking about democracy and we understand what our democracy actually is and could be. And instead, we're arguing with each other online around a lot of half-truths. And we're not recognizing that those are half-truths. And this, again, not partisan. There is truth and fiction out there all over, right? And we have to be able to value that if we want to have a democracy. And so the last question I was thinking about is, how can we sustain our democracy in the new information ecosystems? And this is where it becomes, I think, extra challenging because we just don't know what things are going to look like in the future. We can make some predictions. We can make some very educated guesses, hopefully. But we actually really don't know. We don't know how the technologies will be developing. We don't know what's going to happen sociopolitically. We don't know what's going to happen here in the United States and globally. And so there are some things that we can do right now individually, that we could do as organizations, and that we can promote to help encourage the sustaining of what we do have of our democracy by understanding how to interact within our information ecosystems. We have to recognize you're in multiple information ecosystems and know how to move through them. So you have to think about things like limiting the information that you're taking in to what you can process. You got to stop doom scrolling, okay? You got to put the phone down and don't share it until you know if it's accurate, okay? And make sure you're verifying, not just on social media. If you're just talking to somebody, have a conversation about, well, where did you learn that? Let's talk about this. Here's where I found this information. Oh, have you read this article? Let's engage in discussion around democracy and our civic duty and around how truth plays into that. We want to make sure that we're actively countering misinformation. So you can't just let it pass. You have to actively counter it with evidence. Now, that's not always going to change folks' minds. Oftentimes it doesn't. But it is important to push back against it because it is an acknowledgement that truth has value. Fostering dialogue and resisting polarization. This is really key too. When we get into this my team, your team mentality, that's when we stop caring about truth. We just want to argue and we want to win, and that's not going to get us in the right direction. Making sure that we're strengthening information and civic literacy, but not just in classrooms. We need to strengthen information and civic literacy among the general population. We all need better civics understanding and better understanding of how the technology is affecting that. Making sure we're defending free access to information, politically, socially, and making sure that we are being active in terms of learning and adapting to AI responsibly. That doesn't mean you have to use it, but it means we have to acknowledge that it's here, and you have to understand what it can and can't do, the dangers and the benefits. So that's where I'm going to stop.
In the half an hour we have remaining for audience questions and thoughts, how do we now start to work on this notion of knowing otherwise, given what you all just said and given what you all just heard from each other? How do we now start to work on that in a world where those systems and processes and democracies and governments are constantly changing? It's hard enough to be a human being for things remaining as static as they, quote, have been, but there's a lot of dynamics there. So how do we do that? What do you suggest that we might be able to accomplish, given everything you said, given also what we're facing, and it's getting faster and faster? Who wants to tackle that at first, before we ask our audience for their perspective of how they might do it or questions? Anyone? What do we do? What do we do now? You taught some other things, but let's dig a little bit deeper. How do we make that happen in our spaces?
I'll just start off by saying I think we really have to rethink this idea that we must remain neutral all the time. Meaning that we can't take a position on controversial issues. We can't take a position on things that are happening politically. We can't talk about the things that are happening politically because, oh my gosh, what if somebody, complains or what have you? And so I think, maybe that's a place for us to begin. But it's an incredibly complicated
we can no
issue.
Longer remain neutral.
No longer remain neutral. Well, because this is the idea in the field of education, right? This, Freire's idea of, you can't, there's no neutrality, right? Neutrality is simply supporting the oppressor, right? And so this has been a big part of how I have led my own path through education, is trying to not remain neutral, trying to push back. And I think we have a lot of educators that want to do that. They don't want to be neutral. They want to speak up. They want to fight for democracy. They want to fight for truth, but don't know how to do it in this particular moment because it's real hard to speak truth if you're fired.
Understood. And Robert, given everything that you've done and everything you've heard, what do you think? What's your strategy? What's Robert's rules of order?
I think there's so much to be said here. I'm actually having trouble focusing on where I want to go. But I think to Corinne's point, I think civil dialogue is going to play a key role. Unfortunately, it's very hard to look at society and say like, oh, look at our congressfolk. They're having great civil dialogue. Like, we can't point our youth to that, unfortunately. However, I think we can paint, to Nicole's point, another space, another way of thinking about the world. And so I think there's the few different like tangible strategies I think about. So obviously there's like civil dialogue, like having conversations about complex issues. I think about the work at the USC Democracy Project as well. They're working on a model of collaborative deliberation that kind of breaks out of that binary mold. It's grounded in deliberative polling, which is a real world practice. France recently did it. And basically folks talk about shared problems. So it changes the framing from a binary policy choice to, hey, we have an issue of gun violence. What are several different ways we can address that? It doesn't narrow to 2. It could be 3, 4, 5, 10, 12. And it gets people really listening to the other perspective. And I think that's going to be a key point, is listening to another perspective and not just weighing the evidence, but speaking to your lived experience as well. Like Nicole, you pointed out earlier, it's not a dispassionate conversation. There will be passion from time to time, but we're really listening to each other and working forward because we all live together and we want to create a world that's, fair and just to folks in a legal manner at the very minimum, but also in a humanizing way. We want to work together in a society, and that would really support, I think, the kind of change we want to see. That's a piece of it.
And Nicole, how do we now start to engage in this new flavor of dialogue, right? Because everything that's changing around us is creating those new flavors. It ain't like Baskin Robbins, right? You don't get 31, but you get something that gets to you, that engages you in this process. Perhaps our youth are waiting on this. Thoughts?
Yeah. All the polling that has come out recently has indicated that our young people are not okay, right? Like, I'm not okay. Teachers are not okay. And our parents know that our young people are sitting in schools. Like, the data is showing us that the longer young people spend in schools, the less engaged they are feeling. They do not feel like what's going on in schools is reflecting a world that is literally and figuratively on fire outside of the classroom walls. So we have an issue. And I think in a lot of ways, yes, it is overwhelming. There's tons of work to be done, but I've been finding some comfort in just being very clear about our roles. We all have a role to play. there's much work to be done in information ecosystems and in algorithmic injustice and in AI. My job as an educator and as an educational researcher is that young people are going to be coming into the classroom, getting information from all different kinds of sources. I can't control that part yet, although we can advocate and push upon our elected representatives and on companies. But my job is when people come in knowing that information is coming from everywhere, what do we do as educators in the classroom? And I think I'm thinking of a particular young person as part of the project. His name is Evan. He lived in Alaska, in a rural community in Alaska. And when he came to dialogue with other folks in our network, he was sharing information about gender that he had learned from PragerU, which some of you might be familiar with. It's kind of a conservative website that promotes information, some would say misinformation. And other folks in the social network were like, what do we do about this? Do we do the traditional media literacy where we just try to show him that chart that you may have seen where it shows like the bias of all the different media organizations and tell them that's not a fact, don't bring that to this conversation, here's a fact, here's not a fact? That was not going to work with Evan because that information meant something to him because it made him part of a community, right? This was part of his identity. It was being part of a group and belonging that came from this particular set of information, which regardless of its factual content, it is community building and something that he was not going to turn away from just by being told that he should, or that other folks did not accept that information. And I think when you come to that point as an educator, you say, all right, my job is not simply to say like, believe this information and don't believe this information, or here's how you figure out if this is a fact or not, and then take away everything that's not fact. All of us are living in a kind of an in-between space with information. So what worked for Evan seems like a very basic thing, but it's the most important thing, which is that we need to rebuild a social fabric in which there's other kinds of community than just the folks that we see around us with one different point of view. And since we live in such segregated communities, digital media can be used in a way to connect these young people, to talk to someone from Alaska and talk to someone from Pennsylvania and talk to someone from California and start to get outside of your own experience in a way that is not always possible in our communities. So to me, it seems very simple, but it's very complex that we need to get back to what is the purpose of education in a democratic society. When we have AI, when information can be at our fingertips, factual or not, why do we go to school? And I think we have an answer to that question. It's about connection, it's about community, it's about kinship, it's about solidarity, it's about something more than just getting facts spit at us. But we need to reclaim that together because I believe that the great majority of people in this country want that. Just the voices are being drowned out by a small minority of folks that are very loud and very angry and very uninterested in democratic community. And with solidarity and with common cause, that's what I think education is about building.
And we need strategies too, because the focus of this session is knowing otherwise, right? Systems, information, and power. Well, I'm hearing that systems, information, and power are merging. They're coming together in digital ways in people's heads, like the heads of the young men you're talking about. Well, how are we going to do? What's our strategy? How do we now start to, as people in the schools of education, involved in what it means to learn, seeing things change right before our very eyes very quickly? Then what do we now start to do? What do we need to accomplish to kind of work on that? Because this seems to be omnipotent, right? And omniscient in a way that we've never seen before. What do you think? What should we do?
I mean, I think one of the, not to change topic, I promise this connects.
Okay.
I don't know if anybody else read about this just in the last couple of weeks, but there is a project that is currently in the works. I wrote this down so I could remember the name of it. America 250 Civics Coalition, okay? And this is a joint effort of the Department of Education, America First, Policy Institute, Turning Point USA, 40 plus other organizations. And the idea here is to roll out a civics push across the United States, speakers across college campuses, events across different schools, resources for teachers or whatever else. And it is, if you go and look on the website and you read what is the intent of this, makes it quite clear that the intent is to teach young folks about civics through the lens of the current administration. And so I think that's intensely problematic, given this administration's lack of interest in truth and lack of interest in democracy in general. And so I think one of the things, I think about this in terms of like, how do you counter hate speech? More speech. How do you counter misinformation, disinformation? AI video that's fake of somebody saying something they never said. How do you counter that? More information. You have more people telling their stories, more people talking with each other, more people putting information out there that says, no, this is my experience. This is not the way you say it is. And then allowing people to talk about all of this information. And I think we've got to figure out a way to defuse the team sports idea that keeps happening within these conversations, where it's my side versus your side. And when you're talking about community, right? It's, we have so many people who adhere to a particular political party or to, whatever else, because they feel like they're in a community. So,
What do we do when the truth's at risk?
Yeah.
How can we accomplish these things without the truth? And how can we be sure that the truth is getting to us? Or how can we be sure that the truth isn't getting to us? That seems to be very important for a world and youth and systems where the truth comes through all that stuff we just talked about.
Absolutely.
So now what do we do? I'm putting you on the spot, right? What do we do here in the School of Education? What do we do in our communities when the truth is at risk? Yes, please.
I want to make a comment, and then I want to challenge something that Corinne said about neutrality.
Yeah.
Because while I would agree that to be neutral implies that you almost have no opinion, right? At the same time, conservatives in our school and in our community have felt they've been silenced.
Oh, sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And so how does an instructor, whether it be a K-12 or a university instructor, create a space for diverse viewpoints, even viewpoints that you don't want to hear,
Oh, yeah.
but so that people don't feel silenced? What does that look like in a classroom?
So, and I mean, I don't want to take over, but so what I think we need to have happen is not, and I actually think it would be really harmful to say, to do the opposite of this, turning point situation, civics project, where we're going to say, we're going to discount your perspective and we're only going to teach, this side of the aisle, right? I think that's just as harmful. But I think that if we're going to engage in a real conversation about this in a classroom of any kind, that the teacher, the professor's job is not to come in and say, this is what I believe and this is what you should believe. But I also don't think it's their job to pretend that they have no opinion about anything, pretend that they're this completely neutral human being. And I think that it's about building a space within your classroom or within your, whatever this learning space is, building a community amongst the learners in that space so that when you bring up these big questions that might threaten folks' identities or make them think, oh, do you think bad things about my family because they don't, they disagree with what you're saying or whatever it is, that there's this idea that, we can all disagree in this space, we can agree in this space, but we're going to be safe to do it because we've built the community together. And so I know if I share my perspective that I'm going to be expected to do it in a way that's respectful and reasonable. And I also know that my voice will be heard, but so will other people's voices be heard. And then the facilitator, the teacher, the professor, whoever it is, has to be the one responsible for keeping this in a place where you can talk critically about issues, you can bring up your perspective, you can bring up different points, but we're treating things with treating information and topics with an eye towards what is verifiable truth, and to make a very clear distinction between verifiable truth and opinion about what we do about those truths.
So Robert, given what you heard, how are you going to take this and move your work forward? How are you going to make sure we all get what we need to know and understand, especially the learners, young people?
Yeah.
What's the strategy?
Anthony, I'm going to touch on Corinne's point just for a brief moment, and then I'll pivot. I don't know, this conversation about neutrality has always been important to me, especially as a classroom facilitator of conversation. Something that stands out to me when we talk about dialogue in the classroom is oftentimes I hear, did you talk about the other side? Did you present the other side? And I'm really trying to push on this idea of binary thinking. I understand the political structure of the United States. We have a Democratic Party, we have a Republican Party, we have many other parties, we have many other perspectives. And I want to make sure that I provide a classroom space where I'm truly open. Because if I limit it to binary, I limit our thinking and I limit the possibility before us. So when I think about the role of facilitator, I think there's a term out there called committed impartiality. And this idea that I don't surrender my own perspectives or who I am, but at the same time, I'm going to provide space to students to really critically think about multiple perspectives beyond two. I want to touch on that briefly. And then I just want to, I think about AI a lot, Anthony. And I told Dr. Maddox, it frightens me a little bit, but there's been good use cases of it for democracy. Obviously, there are threats. This idea that information is generated so fast, it's pushed out so fast that every source is bad. It's hard to determine, as you were talking about earlier, Corinne, the source of truth. There was a project out of Brazil, it's called Rosie, it's an AI bot. And there were citizens, I believe they started in Rio de Janeiro. There were citizens who really challenged, they were concerned that I think they're called MPs, their ministers of parliament, were using their funds inappropriately. So they developed an AI bot, they put it on GitHub, it was open source. And with this AI bot, they were pushing in all the transactions of their MPs, and they were flagging, the AI bot was flagging inappropriate charges. And then the citizens, and these were young folks, college-age folks, they were sending this information to their government and say, hey, can you look into this? It always didn't result in change, but there were MPs who were on YouTube publicly apologizing. I'm so sorry. I didn't realize I had 13 transactions in 13 different cities on this date. I will never let that happen again. So they were able to apply pressure. So I think there is possibilities for civic action through AI, but there's also great threats, which I don't want to talk about too much because I could go on forever.
And what it's done is actually allowed people, the connectivity has increased substantially. So how do we now start to work with making sure that people have something to talk about and not be afraid, if you will? But that's hard. Being afraid or not being afraid now is difficult because there's a lot of stuff going on. Cole, how do you plan to use some of these kinds of ideas and your thoughts around that to kind of push the state of the art where you are and what you do?
Yeah, I just want to pick up on the word that Robert brought up, which is binaries. And I think that even in this conversation, we're falling into a binaries that we don't need to. Mm-hmm. So truth versus falsity, liberal, conservative, omnipotence, ignorance. I think that there are multiple truths. There are obviously facts, and we could talk about where that comes in, but I think that any decision that is made about what we should do as a society is never a simple conversation of facts that could not be argued, right? Personal experience, how we should live together are things that involve multiple truths. And I think that's where we bring the temperature down in a classroom, is by acknowledging and welcoming multiple truths as long as there is a bedrock of particular values. And this is where I talk a lot about little p versus big P politics. We often think that, and I always say everything we do in the classroom is political. But I mean little p politics, not big P politics, which is Democrat, Republican, electoral politics. Everything is political in that little p, in that every single choice that we make is expressing a value judgment of what life together could look like. Whether I let my students speak up in class or if I silence them and insist that I am the only voice in the room, that is a political choice. The kinds of relationships I have with every person, the kinds of books and voices I allow into the room and the ones I don't, these are all political choices. They are not partisan choices. We have come to a place where I think a lot of us are very struggling, is that we're coming to a place where little p values about democracy, about empathy, about the autonomy of individuals is becoming a partisan value. So then we're getting messed up, right? Because classrooms do not need to be places that are partisan, but they are places that are political. Democracy is not neutral. Democracy has a value judgment to it. If we can't agree on that, that's where the place where I think we're getting to, that stands need to be taken to stand for the value of democracy and the values that are part of democracy. But once we get to that point, no one sitting in our classroom is any one thing. Like, we are not, like we said, talking points. We are not a composite of like, here's a liberal and here's a conservative in my classroom. They are individuals with complex life experiences that want to figure out a way to build a meaningful life and hopefully live amongst others who are living meaningful lives. And that's where it comes back to that those ideas that I was talking about an articulation of needs. What are we all striving for here? Like, if we're all hurting, we all need something. What perspective am I coming at this issue from? How can I understand a different one? And yes, hard decisions sometimes have to be made where we can't make everyone happy. But if we can't get to a place where we can see each other as fellow citizens in the largest sense of the term, an expansive view, then we will continue to have this scarcity mindset, winner take all battle. And in the end, when you think about global warming and you think about all the other challenges we face, it will be a race toward our mutual destruction if we do not figure out a way to live together. And I think more and more we are figuring that out. And our politics needs to catch up to what I think most people out there are thinking. And that's the role, I think, of public education. Again, I believe that there is public will among families and communities. Everyone loves their elementary school, even if they have issues about education writ large. The more granular you get to the people you see every day, the more we can find ways to live together in commonality. And that's why I think that schools are going to be the places that lead us on this pathway toward the next thing. Schools need to be the place that are preparing us for a world to come rather than just surviving the world that we're in. That's where I think we can find hope.
And so then how we integrate those technologies into our current environments matter. Because our students are watching us while we actually do that. They're watching us when we're successful. They watch us when we're not as successful. That's going to be hard. It's going to be hard because right now we're all generative AI, right? Dancing and happy. What happens when generative AI and agentic AI start to merge? I don't know, take a look online. See what types of AI. You'll see 15 types of artificial intelligence, 15. So we're talking about 2. So when that happens, how can we prepare our students for that onslaught of opinion that will come from something that, quote unquote, may not be human, but critically important as they need to understand it for them to get a sense of what it is and how to evaluate what it is, how to tell somebody that. How can we do that? Because that's what's looming, I think. But talk to me. How can we do that?
Can I mention just one thing about that before?
Please do. Oh, yes.
I was going to say that I think it's so amazing that we've allowed AI to dictate the terms of the conversation in education to such a huge extent. And I think that it needs to stop. And every time people ask me that I need to have an AI policy in my class, I turn around and say, I want to have a learning policy. Let's have a conversation about learning. And if we could just all keep flipping the script on, we don't need to allow yes, this tool is going to continue to be with us. And yes, we need to talk about it. And yes, we need to figure out how to work with it. We are just rolling over as a field and allowing the ed tech companies to kind of dictate that this tool is inevitable and all powerful. I don't believe it's omnipotent. I don't think young people believe it's omniscient. It's dumb in a lot of ways. And yes, there are things coming down the pathway, but we are the ones that, like Corinne said, created it. But let's talk about what learning means, because young people know that AI, even though they use it, they know the difference between learning and using AI. But if our school systems value compliance and obedience and completing something rather than learning, then it makes sense to use AI, because if that's all we're asking for. So we all need to have a conversation about learning rather than always talking about the AI tool and letting it lead us. That's my little rant about AI.
I agree with your rant, though.
It's
true.
It could very well be that in some of these areas, it pays not to be an innovator, but a late adopter. Because some of the innovations that actually our students are having access to may be making them more difficult for us to be able to bring in. So then we need, as educators, I guess, more strategies for how to deal with the quote-unquote diffusion of those kinds of ideas. And there may be, some value in being a laggard in this, as opposed to being an early adopter or an innovator, if you will. So what do we do in our classrooms? What should we do here this year? What should we do at USC, do you think, in order to promote the kind of things that you're talking about and to integrate those ideas along the way, even those of you from other spaces and places? What do you think? Offer your ideas. Dr.
Hyde. So I think, one of the key things is we have to acknowledge the extreme disruption in the educational space right now. Whether we don't know how it's all going to work out, right? But we do know that we're in a period of a lot of disruption. So we have to acknowledge that, first of all. And then I think, what we've got to do in our, if we're talking about teacher education, I think, we really have to think about how can we have real, authentic conversations with our future teachers about exactly what you're talking about. What does it mean to learn? what is the world that we're preparing our students for in the future as well? Because I think, things are changing at such an incredible pace that I really think that it's very possible that, the landscape of technology, the landscape of the internet, but more than that, the landscape of the jobs that we do and, how we live our lives in general could be dramatically changed by the various AI technologies that are currently available and, being developed. And so I think we have to be very authentic with students and with our students and ask them to be authentic with their students as well, and saying, we don't really understand this fully. We are figuring this out as this technology is being developed, and we need to critically think and we need to problem solve. And I think it's really important to bring students, whether it's our students or whether it's our students' students, into that conversation. What are you seeing in your day-to-day life around, AI? What are you seeing in your, student teaching placement around AI or advanced technologies? What does that mean? What do you think it says about learning? Do you think your students are actually learning? And then also engaging with them about the assignments and the work they complete and asking them to engage with AI so that they can understand the nature of it, what it is, and how motivation can be impacted. Because I think that's really, really critically important as well.
So how do we now start to build the skills necessary to project and make sure that our learning spaces are authentic? How do we do that? Robert, Nicole, thoughts about how that might happen, given what you've just talked about and what it is we need to know and do in our learning spaces. Authentic.
My expertise is around civic education. So I think of, when I think about a K-12 classroom, I think about tackling authentic problems, real world problems. And to your point, very early, Nicole, I loved when you said it, and I was like, oh, I was supposed to say that too. You brought up this idea of civics everywhere. And I am a firm believer in that. I have seen examples in math classes. The new California math framework speaks to the idea that we're going to apply mathematics to real world problems. So I think through how much stronger will we be as a democracy if, and again, people have skills, but could we further develop those skills using mathematics and science principles to have literacy about how to understand climate change, and when facts are presented, to have really strong understanding of that. And again, I know that literacy is there, but to really invest in that, that idea of using those scientific technology principles in real world, I think through that speaks to my heart. And as a former classroom teacher, that was the easiest to teach the kids when they got to tackle a real world problem. They were motivated, they were ready to go. And obviously it was standards aligned, but they were really passionate about making a difference in their community. So that is what comes to mind first, Dr. Maddox.
Excellent. Nicole?
I think, so I talk a lot about a world building kind of education, right? So what if we all went into our classrooms and said, our job is to build a new world together? I'm influenced a lot by speculative fiction and speculative art. So the traditions of Afrofuturism, different indigenous futurisms. And it's not about fantasy or escapism. It's about imagining. And I always tell my teachers, if you just walk into the school system and you've already narrowed your perspective to what currently is possible, then you've already lost the game. We need to dream big. And then every good teacher knows how to adapt to whatever the pragmatic constraints are that we face. But we have to have the big vision first. So if we all went into schools with young people and said that all of us are here together to figure out how to build a world that is more compassionate and better than the one that we currently live in. And none of us know what that world is because we've never lived in it before. And if we all start from that place of inquiry, I talk about like 5 different commitments that every teacher in every grade level, every subject area, if we all organized our curriculum around inquiry, storytelling, networking, advocacy, and imagination, and we all applied that, because that can be applied to any subject area. If we all made that our work, and we all encircled those commitments with a value of young people being agents and experts of their own experience, and truly saw them as knowledge makers as opposed to folks that we are there to transport knowledge to, I think that would take us a long way toward building a more creative and engaging and relevant curriculum. And we've been saying this forever. And I think that it's at a moment right now where we have the resources at our disposal to make that happen in ways that we never have before. So I see a lot of possibility. Like, it is a very challenging and scary time. And like I said, we're not okay in lots of ways, but I think we're also, the portal is open. So Arundhati Roy, the author, when the pandemic started, she said that the pandemic is a portal, a famous piece that she wrote at the beginning of the pandemic, that amidst the horror of the pandemic, that we could at least see it as the silver lining of it is that it's opening a pathway to new possible ways of being. We thought that school was never going to be the same. Do you remember that time when we were all in 2020? Like, maybe school will never be, like, it'll be a community, like, we're going to change everything. And then we just went back into the schools and we tried to snap back and just do things the same way better, as opposed to stepping through the portal. But I really believe that, like, we're seeing now that it's still open, and that, like, we're at a breaking point where something has to change because everyone knows that we can't keep going on the way that we are. So I see it as a time of huge possibility, as long as we can, again, not feel alone, to Robert's point about folks being at risk of losing their jobs. That is real. So that's why we need a mass movement behind it, so that individuals are not out there to be picked off for doing this work. We need to be in it together. And that's what I think we're at, that precipice.
That's a really great prompt. And it's so important. That's most of world building, because a lot of our young people are engaged in world building. But before we go to your voices, which are critically important here, I want to just leave the audience with one view of the notion of technology. I teach I've been fortunate to be a science teacher educator for 15 years, but I also teach in the Freshman Academy at Viterbi. And so what I try to do is to present them with a different view of technology. These are people who have actually gone out of their way to make sure they're actually looking at technology and learning in the same way. Let me pose something to you, that science, physics, chemistry, geology, and biology are the sciences that we normally used to seeing in the universe and those type of things. But let me suppose something else, that within the context of how it is we educate, let's assume, and I think in education we do this, that we now start to understand more about the social behavioral sciences, right? That rules a lot of what we do. But let me just now start to pose one more thing. Suppose we thought or understood that what was happening here is the infusion of what's called sciences of the artificial. Not sciences that are naturally made. Not sciences that happen because we interact, but sciences that human beings create. Now, we may not need some work on that, right? Design science is one possible. Data science is another. These are sciences that, quote unquote, weren't here before we were here. So what I'm hearing is a way to take the notion of technology to try to maybe share it with youth from perspective of things that are created. Let them know that the sciences that they're wrestling with are also ones that they created, that were created, and that they too can now start to create the same way. So now I don't know how that's going to go, but there are other kinds of sciences lurking that are, if you look at artificial sciences and what some of them are, another one is computational science that was not here with the Big Bang. So we brought with us a whole bunch of other things that we can now start to see in front of us to use, to leverage and create spaces for learning, create dialogue and other kinds of things, and not let, quote unquote, those artificial scientists and those who invest in them and build the artifacts for them alone have their voice, and we now start to figure out a way to include our voice if we acknowledge the fact that those things exist. I think that's possible. Again, your voices always matter. We'd like to hear any ideas that you might have, or questions that you might have based on our discussion today. Please let us know what your thoughts are, where you're headed, and also what you believe. And we'd love to hear from you. Anyone at all.
We do have a question from online already, so we can get started with that. It's from William. As a science educator, how do we teach critical thinking skills to differentiate between these information pieces to filter these neutrally, but allow them to change the dichotomy of schools being the places that give knowledge to places that filter knowledge, when so many educators are overtasked to expeditiously cover voluminous curriculums? Where is the balance? Are there systems an educator can implement to handle this?
That's a great question.
Multiple.
Multiple questions, for sure. Your thoughts before I start launching off?
I mean, I think that's an area where I see that if we played our cards right with the technology, we could do really cool things to take some of the weight off of teachers. and all of the things that they spend time doing that maybe don't necessarily need the full teacher's expertise, okay, but does need the oversight of a teacher. And so if we can come up with trustworthy, reliable, data secure AI models that can be used by teachers as a TA, a teaching assistant. It can pull articles for you. It can, create a list of vocabulary for you. It can generate all kinds of things for you, right? And these tools are already out there. magicschool.ai or Brisk or whatever. These are already infused in schools, but they're not as reliable and they're not as data secure as I would like these to be in the future. And they are still, subject to the big challenges that we see with AI right now, because it's still just very much being developed. But I hope that we could work towards a place where we use some of these technologies to fix the incredible amount of work that teachers have to do on a daily basis and give them more time back to actually interact with their students and engage one-on-one or small groups or whole class. Anybody else?
Yeah, this gets back to that question. I think that's such a great question because, again, the idea of the roles that we have to play. And we're here talking about like these advances in AI, and teachers are like, yeah, but like I still have to get through this like incredible amount of content that is not possible in a school year. So we're still talking about issues of test-based accountability, standards, class size. Like these are basic educational issues that we're still talking about, and we want folks to be jumping ahead to like these like other issues when we haven't solved these like very crucial basic parts of our system that we could be spending time advocating for. And I think I might quibble a little bit about like I think that what we do is then we have folks like EdTech and AI come in and say like, well, we could solve that problem for you when that's just a Band-Aid on. So then they're going to say keep your class sizes and let's have AI come in and help you. So I think in some ways we can't let EdTech be the ones dictating that they can solve these problems that are fundamental education problems that we've had way before this technology was here. So yes, it's hard to ask teachers to change their practice when you have these pressures that have shown, again, that our system hasn't changed since the early 20th century when we're living in 2025. So I think this is where we need to put some pressure on like not always looking to the outside for the solution, but pressuring our education system itself to change. And I think, again, we need to not think about doing one more thing, but about streamlining our commitments to the things that we want to do and making sure that the other stuff falls into place. So I think it doesn't help a teacher day to day, but I think this again speaks to the idea for a political movement we need around pushing for education systems as opposed to letting ourselves be distracted fully by the information systems.
I think there's a lot of benefit to being influenced by other disciplines. For example, when I think about agency, I just don't think about schools, I think about the law. The law is ripe with agency relationships that have happened over centuries. So what our machines will have to do is to be able to demonstrate or interact with me so that I feel that it is indeed my agent. And so it also happens in economics. So one strategy is to not be content with whatever domain you think you know. In other words, feel free to now start to think across domains, build bridges and relationships so you can borrow not only language, but processes and procedures from those domains. And if fortunate enough, also borrow from those who speak different languages. Because my sense is that AI developed by individuals whose natural language is English might be different than AI developed by individuals whose natural language is Mandarin. So what generative means to both of those cultures and languages varies. So within ourselves, within our communities, that same thing might exist. We have an opportunity to explore that, bring that out, acknowledge it, and embrace people in the process of doing that. Other thoughts or questions, please? There's someone coming.
One of the bullet points that really stood out to me was the point that we shouldn't call it a controversial conversation because that discourages discussion. And I think that's pretty spot on because people want to avoid those kind of conversations. And then your bullet points on how do we have students write essays, change that from just a thesis that we defend. I think that that's a great starting point in our youth's education, like in high school. But what I want to know and how can we take this kind of thinking, this kind of education into the adult world once people are outside of the academic environment? Like you said, law enforcement, they're not in an academic setting. You have politicians, they're not in an academic setting. Healthcare, how do you continue this kind of education with the adult non-learner population?
Always have answers. Please go ahead.
Oh, did you want to?
Well, I would just share. I wrote a book in 2021 with a conservative thinker, right? And it was an exchange of letters on a number of controversial topics. And now that was before things got even more polarized than they are now. But I do believe that there is a lot of people out there who want to talk, who don't want to just yell, but the voices that get heard the most are the voices on the extremes, and that scares people off. And I think part of the job of education is, can you create a space for real dialogue where people can listen? And I sometimes think you have to set ground rules on how to do that. But I do think there's a willingness among many, but it's very easy to get intimidated if you watch too much of the news.
I think libraries, there are third spaces in life that are not simply formal educational spaces. Chris Gutierrez talks about the idea of third spaces. And in living rooms and in talking to parents, like I've been thinking a lot about my own family. I have very different views than a lot of members of my own family. I think there's a lot of pain and a lot of difficulty that I have about, I talk about empathy a lot, and then I struggle when I go home with my own family and having that. So I think being more open about that, I'm thinking about writing about that. Like, I think a lot of people are in that situation of like people we love or people that we care for. These are conversations that are happening all the time in those spaces. And I think that we need to like lean into that a little bit more into that. And again, we can't do that until we can fully like let ourselves be a little bit more vulnerable than this time is making us. And it's the same thing for law enforcement and healthcare. It's so hard to open up right now. Everyone's on their guard. And someone needs to take the first vulnerable step. And I do think educators can be that first step, but it's going to take time, I think, for that to roll out, like you're saying, to other places. But we really, it's a cultural problem, not a technical problem, and that makes it really hard. But I think if there's something we can lean into there.
Yeah, just to add to the larger conversation, I agree with your point, Nicole, about these conversations are happening. Going back to the idea of deliberation, there's a project out of Colorado State, and they actually bring stakeholders from the community, and they talk about a shared problem. Like, let's say it's water rights access or something like that. And they have citizens in society, these are adults, and they're deliberating. They have experts help develop these deliberation guides that are fact-based on different approaches. And these adults listen to different perspectives, and they come to some sort of understanding of the issue at hand. And they involve public officials who are also making decisions on this. And so I think there are good examples of it happening right now. And there's tons of examples, to your point, about informal and also community-based education when it comes to having discussions of complex topics.
The trust is so central. We trust our political figures. You mentioned law enforcement, healthcare. I'm not ready to trust a machine. However, I think I know it when I feel it, when I see that trust. So now I'm waiting on the state of the art to move to the point where I can trust. And then what happens when I do? I don't know. But until it does, I'm skeptical.
I have a question about the climate that we're in, and that was addressed initially when you first started this talk. And even in California, as it was addressed, there are some school districts that have certain policies that prevent teachers from allowing the types of discussions that we're all discussing we would prefer to be having. So I'm wondering also, I see you're from UCLA and the rest are from USC, but we're all California schools. And what overriding, first of all, the Federal Department of Education, whatever's left of it, and will there be one? And then what's happening and how does that affect California's Department of Education, and how then does it trickle down to various districts, various colleges and universities, and the educators in these systems. So I'm wondering what any of you may have to say about this whole puzzle that we're all faced with right now. And how do we address it? And what's the reality of somebody feeling like in a certain school district they can't open up dialogue? Mm-hmm. What are the policies coming off of several years ago when all the protests erupted in the universities in California, and the policies of the federal government on top of that about all of that? So those are some of my thoughts. I'm just flowing with thoughts.
Yeah. No. I think that there's something, I think folks, like, education can seem like a black box sometimes about, we don't know what's going on in there. So we come up with these like wild surmises that like they're having these conversations where we're brainwashing children, proselytizing at them to feel certain ways about certain issues. And every time we open the doors as opposed to close them, we realize that that's not actually happening. And I think sometimes there's a mentality, and I feel it too, about like, when the public seems to be having an idea about what's going on in classrooms that's not accurate, there can be a first reaction of defensiveness and to close down and to say like, no, like you don't know, that's not true, I know what I'm doing. But if we can fight that urge to close down and then open up and like welcome people into the classroom, it's scary at first, but oftentimes that's where the understanding can start to build, where you realize that, oh, talking about an issue doesn't mean that they're telling my kid how to think about a certain issue. Like we need to, like, again, it's that first step of being vulnerable and being willing to like, maybe we shouldn't have to be opening up that dialogue ourselves. Maybe we should have a two-way street. But if someone's got to do it, I want to be the educator to do it. And I think that it doesn't solve it. But I think every time those restrictive policies come down, or rancorous school board meetings where people are yelling at each other, it's because they're not actually in the same place together to see what it actually looks like. So we need to have more interaction as opposed to less. Which again, like I said, at this moment is very difficult to do. And we are getting to a place though, where I feel like because of the federal policies, localities are going to be the ones that have to take the step. So that means that there are possibilities at those individual school board meetings in the individual school districts where change can be made even as the chaos continues to roil around us. I think we have to get to the closest level of community that we can, and that's where change can start to happen.
Yeah, I think the conversations need to, as much as possible, involve humans actually seeing each other, as opposed to commenting on a post or commenting on a news article. Because I think we respond to each other in general differently as humans in a conversation than we do to an anonymous comment online, or even if there is a name on it, but you don't know that person, right? Well, people behave differently in these spaces. And what I think is a big challenge of this also is that as these online spaces have grown over the years, and people have built these communities online, adults, young people, we've lost some of our in-person communities where some of these conversations could be taking place. And so, we see a lot of times, for example, people are, oh, these kids are on social media all the time. Why are they always on technology? Have you been outside lately? There's not a lot of other kids out there a lot of times, depending on where you are. And there may not even be spaces, depending on where you are in your neighborhood. There may not be spaces for people to just, kids, adults, to just be, that doesn't involve paying for something or, doesn't involve a lot of travel or whatever. And so it's this complex thing of figuring out, well, how do we talk to each other in person? Where can we talk to each other in person? And I think also there's a lot of engagement and connection that can happen over video as well. And I've been really surprised by this actually over the years when I became a professor, and I've been teaching online for 16 years. And I was skeptical at first about people are, you're going to do teacher education online. How are you ever going to get to know any of your students? And I was like, we'll make it happen. And we did, because you do get to know people in those spaces. You see their dog walking on the screen, or, you see their posters in the background and you ask about them. And so you do build community. And so I think, there is room for potentially a happy medium that's somewhere between, like, we all have to be in the same room looking at each other all the time and to have these big conversations, and we're all just going to send angry comments back and forth to each other online without really seeing each other's humanity. And I do think there's something about just looking at another human being and hearing each other's actual stories and perspectives, maybe getting a little cognitive dissonance going on in there, and go, wait a minute, that person's story, their experience doesn't match what I've been told about this person, or about people like this, or about people in this area, or about this policy, or whatever it is. So yeah, I think it's about figuring out where the spaces are where we can have the dialogue, and where will the dialogue be authentic and not, have this barrier of social media commenting, where a lot of people seem to just have very different personalities when in discussions, when they have that little extra bit of distance, and they know nobody's gonna look them right in the face and say, how dare you say that, right?
So let's commit to knowing otherwise, and commit to also knowing otherwise regardless of the system, regardless of the information, or regardless of the power. That's quite a commitment, but that's what we do in education. That's what we do in learning. It so happens. First of all, please join me in thanking our panelists. And again, thank you so much for coming. Let's talk and get around each other and embrace some of these great ideas. Again, thanks for coming.